The mountains in winter are merciless, a place where the wind cuts like knives, where hunger gnaws at you until every step feels heavier than the last. For most men, it's a death sentence. For Ethan Cole, a 17-year-old drifter with nothing but a threadbare coat and the will to survive, it was just another day. Until he saw the old man. He was collapsed in the snow, skin pale as the frost around him, blood soaking through the hide on his shoulder. His breathing was shallow. Any other man might have turned away. In these mountains, someone else's burden could quickly become your grave. But Ethan didn't turn away. He lifted the stranger onto his back and began the long, dangerous climb over the eastern pass, unaware that every step was leading him deeper into a storm he couldn't see coming. Because the man he carried was no ordinary wanderer, and by the next dawn, 30 armed warriors would be standing at Ethan's door. If stories of courage, survival, and unexpected brotherhood pull you in, stick around. This one will take you right into the heart of the mountains. Hit that like button, subscribe, and share this with someone who loves a good tale of grit and loyalty. It's the easiest way to help us keep bringing you stories that make you feel every word. The wind that morning was the kind that steals the breath from your lungs. Ethan Cole pressed forward anyway, boots crunching through snow so hard-packed it rang beneath his heels. His coat was a patchwork of repairs, the kind of garment more whole than fabric. But he had learned long ago that complaining didn't make the cold any kinder. Hunger gnawed at his gut, a dull ache that had been with him for days. Winter in these mountains didn't care who you were, rich rancher or homeless drifter, it took without asking. Ethan's plan was simple. Keep moving, find the low pass before the next storm, and hope the deer trails hadn't been buried under fresh powder. He might have made it without stopping, if not for the sound. At first, he thought it was just the wind moaning over the ridges. But then it came again. A rasping breath, wet and uneven. He slowed, scanning the white expanse until his eyes caught a dark shape half buried in snow near a stand of stunted pines. For a moment, he thought it was a dead elk. But as he drew closer, the shape shifted, and Ethan saw a human face. An old man lay sprawled in the drift, skin gray, beard rimed with ice, blood seeping from beneath a crude hide wrap on his shoulder. Ethan crouched beside him. The man's eyes opened briefly, cloudy and unfocused. His lips moved, but the words were in a language Ethan didn't understand. Still, the tone carried urgency. The old man tried to push himself up, only to collapse back with a pained groan. Ethan's mind raced. In this cold, he might have less than an hour before the man slipped past saving. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to move on. Helping meant slowing down, burning precious strength he couldn't spare. And yet, Ethan had seen enough men die alone in the wild to know what it felt like to be left behind. With a muttered curse at his own stubbornness, he slid his arms under the man and hauled him up. The weight was deceptive. The old man was lean, but dead weight in the snow felt like carrying stone. Ethan adjusted his grip and started toward the eastern pass, each step sinking into drifts that reached his knees. The old man coughed weakly against Ethan's shoulder, the sound cutting through the wind like a reminder that this wasn't just a sack of bones. He was carrying someone's father, someone's grandfather. The pass was a place most men avoided in winter. Jagged rock faces funneled the wind into screaming gusts, and the snow could hide deep crevasses that swallowed travelers whole. Ethan's breath burned in his chest. His thighs screamed for rest, but stopping meant frost settling into his bones. He talked to the old man just to keep himself moving. "We'll get there," he muttered. "Don't know where there is for you, but we'll get there." The man mumbled in reply, the same foreign syllables over and over, like a chant or a plea. By midday, clouds had begun to stack over the peaks, the kind that promised a whiteout before nightfall. Ethan angled them toward a narrow shelf where the rock broke the wind. He set the man down gently, pulled a strip of dried meat from his own meager supply, and pressed it into the old man's hand. The man didn't eat, only shook his head and pointed toward the far end of the pass. The message was clear enough: keep moving. Ethan didn't argue. If this man had the strength to insist on a direction, it meant the destination mattered more than rest. The climb grew worse as the day deepened. Drifts became chest-high walls, and the narrow path forced Ethan to hug the cliffside while the wind tried to tear them free. At one point, the old man stiffened and glanced behind them. Ethan followed his gaze but saw nothing except the endless sweep of snow. Still, he didn't like the way the man's grip tightened on his arm. They were being watched. Ethan felt it in his gut. He pushed harder, half lifting, half dragging the man through the narrowing trail. Near dusk, the pass widened into a shallow basin, ringed with stone. On the far side, a trail dipped toward the tree line. The old man stirred and pointed again, urgency in his eyes. "Almost there," Ethan grunted. His legs trembled with every step. Somewhere in the timber below, a raven called, a low, harsh sound that felt out of place in the still air. By the time they reached the edge of the trees, Ethan's breath came in ragged bursts and his arms felt like lead. The old man patted his arm once, a gesture that might have been thanks, and then pointed into the gathering shadows. It was there, in the lee of the first pines, that Ethan stopped. He knew if he went farther, he'd lose the last of his daylight for the return trip. The old man seemed to understand. He reached inside his hide wrap and pulled out a small carved stone, placing it firmly in Ethan's palm. The surface was smooth, but etched with intricate symbols. Before Ethan could ask what it meant, the old man turned and disappeared into the trees, moving with surprising speed for someone so near collapse moments ago. Ethan stood there, catching his breath, staring at the stone. Something about it made the hairs on his neck rise. It wasn't just a gift. It felt like a message, though he couldn't read its meaning. Snow began to fall, soft and slow, settling over the trail the old man had taken. With a shiver, Ethan turned back toward his own shelter, unaware that this single act of carrying a stranger across the pass had already set in motion events that would bring 30 warriors to his door by morning. The storm arrived sooner than Ethan expected. By the time he'd made it halfway back to his camp, the wind had picked up to a howl, and the snow came in thick sheets that blurred the path ahead. He leaned into it, head down, one arm shielding his eyes. The carved stone in his pocket felt heavier with each step, as if the thing had its own gravity. Every so often he'd pull it out, turning it over in his fingers, wondering why the old man had given it to him. There were no answers in its smooth black surface, only those strange, deliberate markings that seemed to shift in the flickering light of his campfire once he finally reached shelter. His shelter was nothing more than a shallow cave set into a cliffside, barely large enough to keep him and his gear dry. He ducked inside, shaking snow from his shoulders, and set about building a small fire. The stone sat beside him on the ground, catching the glow of the flames. For a long while, Ethan just stared at it, listening to the wind batter the rocks outside. There was a nagging thought he couldn't shake. The old man had been out there alone, wounded in one of the deadliest stretches of mountain terrain. That wasn't bad luck. That was running from something, or toward something. The next morning brought clear skies but brittle cold. Ethan stepped outside to check the snow depth and stopped short. The snow around the cave's mouth was churned with prints, not his and not the small, light steps of an old man. These were broad, deep impressions, dozens of them, circling his shelter like a noose. He knelt, brushing away powder until the details showed clear, the distinct oval shape and nail-head pattern of horseshoes. Whoever had been here hadn't just passed through, they'd lingered. Watched. Ethan's first thought was settlers, maybe a patrol or hunters. But the more he studied the tracks, the less sense that made. These weren't the steel-shod hooves of frontier mounts. They were rawhide-wrapped, the kind he'd seen on the ponies of mountain tribes. He counted at least 15 sets. His mouth went dry. 15 riders up here in the high pass meant one thing. They were on a mission. And missions like that didn't tend to end quietly. Back inside, Ethan's eyes fell again on the carved stone. It was still where he'd left it, but now he noticed something he hadn't before. Faint warmth, as though it had been lying in the sun. He turned it over and caught the faint glint of red pigment in the carvings, dulled by age but still visible. He didn't know the symbols, but he knew craftsmanship, and this was the work of a skilled hand. Whoever owned it had valued it enough to keep it close. The thought crept in unbidden. Maybe the riders were looking for it. By midday, the mountain was quiet again, the kind of quiet that made the skin between Ethan's shoulder blades itch. He set out to check his snares, moving slowly through the knee-deep snow. But everywhere he went, he saw signs that the riders had been there too. broken branches at shoulder height, crushed snow where horses had stood waiting, even a length of rawhide thong lying half-buried in the drifts. They'd fanned out across the slope like they were searching for someone. The question was whether they'd found him. Returning to camp, Ethan kept glancing over his shoulder. He'd learned long ago to trust the feeling of being watched, and it was on him heavy now. At the cave, he paused, scanning the ridgelines. That's when he spotted it. A mark carved into the bark of a spruce just uphill from his shelter. 3 vertical lines crossed by a single arrow. He didn't know the meaning, but he knew enough to recognize a signpost when he saw one. It wasn't meant for him. It was meant for others who would follow. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Every crack of ice outside, every groan of the wind through the rocks made him reach for the knife at his belt. More than once, he thought about taking the stone and throwing it into the deepest ravine he could find. But something in him resisted. Whatever trouble it carried, the old man had chosen to give it to him. And Ethan, for all his wandering and hunger, lived by one rule. You didn't spit on the trust of a man who'd looked you in the eye. By dawn, the decision was made for him. The sound of hooves drifted up from the lower slope, not hurried, but steady, deliberate. Ethan crouched at the cave entrance, peering through a gap in the rocks. At first he saw nothing. Then movement resolved from the trees. Dark figures on horseback, riding 2 by 2, the steam of their breath curling in the frozen air. And at their head, a tall rider with broad shoulders and a thick braid that swung against his back. The horses stopped within sight of the cave, and for a long moment, no one moved. Ethan's grip tightened on the stone in his pocket. Whoever these men were, they hadn't come this far to exchange pleasantries. And as their leader dismounted and began walking toward him, Ethan understood. The weight he'd carried across the pass wasn't just an old man's body. It was a burden he hadn't asked for, one that had already drawn 30 warriors to his door. Ethan didn't move. The leader of the riders stopped a few paces from the cave, his eyes scanning every detail. The snow patterns, the faint smoke from Ethan's fire, even the disturbed powder where Ethan had stepped out earlier. He said nothing at first, but the weight of his stare was almost physical. Behind him, the rest of the war party sat their horses in absolute silence, their breath pluming in the freezing air. The stillness was eerie. No restless shifting, no murmured words. These were disciplined men. The leader finally spoke in English, each word measured. We're looking for someone, an elder. He came through this pass yesterday. Ethan kept his voice steady. I saw a man, wounded, headed east. That was the truth, though not the whole of it. The leader's gaze narrowed. He is my uncle. The way he said it left no doubt this wasn't a casual search. You helped him? Ethan hesitated, then gave a small nod. The leader glanced over his shoulder at his men and murmured something in their language. The reaction was subtle, a shift in posture, a tightening of reins, but Ethan felt the mood sharpen. One of the warriors dismounted and began to walk slowly around the cave, eyes on the ground. He stopped at the spruce where the symbol was carved, touched it lightly, then said something low to the leader. The leader's expression hardened. This mark, he said, pointing to the tree, tells our people where to gather. This place is not safe for you. Ethan almost laughed at that, a short, humorless sound. Safe? You've got 30 men outside my door. The leader didn't smile. Not from us. From those who follow the mark. Ethan's stomach sank. You're saying someone else is coming. The leader nodded once. Men with rifles, settlers. They hunt us. They hurt my uncle. The words carried no drama, just cold fact. We follow their trail here. Ethan thought back to the churned snow he'd seen on his trap lines. They were all over the slopes yesterday. The leader's eyes stayed on him. And yet they did not find you. Maybe they do not know you are here, or maybe they do. The implication was sharp as a knife. The warrior who had circled the cave returned, holding something in his hand, a strip of torn leather, stained dark at one end. The leader took it, turning it over. Blood, he said simply. Fresh. Ethan felt the carved stone in his pocket like a live coal. He wondered if these men already knew he had it, or if they were here to confirm their suspicion. Either way, there was no easy way to hide from 30 sets of eyes. The leader took a step closer. "My uncle gave you something." Not a question, a statement. Ethan didn't answer right away. The wind hissed across the pass, carrying the faint creak of saddles as the mounted warriors shifted their weight. Finally, Ethan pulled the stone from his pocket, holding it up so the firelight caught the markings. The leader's gaze fixed on it instantly. He reached out, then stopped short of touching it. "This belongs to our people. It is a promise." "A promise for what?" Ethan asked. The leader's expression didn't change. "For protection, for debt paid. You carry it now. That means you are part of this." He gestured toward the ridgeline. "The men who hurt my uncle are close. They will come through here. When they do, blood will spill. If you stay, you will be in the middle of it." Ethan looked at the horizon, where the wind drove plumes of snow off the peaks. There was no clear answer in the white expanse, only danger, whichever way he turned. The leader studied him for another long moment, then stepped back. "Decide quickly. We will return when the sun is low." With that, he turned and mounted his horse in one fluid motion. The rest of the war party wheeled as one and began riding down the slope, their passage leaving deep tracks that the wind was already starting to erase. Ethan stood there until they vanished into the tree line, the stone heavy in his hand. When they were gone, the silence was almost worse. He walked to the edge of the clearing, scanning for any sign of movement. The spruce mark stood out against the snow, dark and deliberate, like a warning he couldn't read. Somewhere beyond that ridge, men with rifles were tracking the same path the warriors had just taken. And if the leader was right, they'd be here before nightfall. Ethan slipped the stone back into his pocket and returned to the cave, his mind turning over one fact he couldn't ignore. Whatever game he'd stumbled into, the snow around his home was already marked. The light was fading fast when Ethan returned to his cave. The air had that brittle stillness that always came before nightfall in the high country, when even the wind seemed to hold its breath. He added a few sticks to the fire, but the flames gave off more smoke than heat. Every so often, he'd step outside to listen. The pass was empty, yet it didn't feel empty. The mark carved into the spruce loomed in his thoughts like a ticking clock, the kind of sign you didn't ignore if you wanted to live. Inside, he moved through his few belongings, checking each one by habit. His knife, dull but serviceable, his cooking pot, the bundle of dried venison wrapped in cloth, all accounted for. But as his hand brushed the floor of the cave, he felt a disturbance, a faint scuff in the dirt, the kind you notice only if you know exactly how you left it. Someone had been inside while he was gone, and not just a curious animal. This was the kind of movement that came from deliberate searching. He crouched low, scanning the firelight shadows. A small pile of river stones he kept for waiting snares had been shifted. His sleeping roll lay at a slightly different angle. Whoever it was had taken nothing, or maybe they'd found nothing they were looking for. His hand instinctively went to the pocket where the carved stone rested. Still there, still warm against his palm, like it had been waiting for him to check. The unease pushed him to the mouth of the cave again. From there, he could see the slope stretching down toward the tree line. The wind had erased most tracks, but here and there were faint impressions, wide at the base, narrowing toward the front. Hooves, fresh enough to glisten with melt where the day's weak sun had touched them. He counted at least 6 different sets leading in from the east, all converging toward his shelter. None led away. That meant whoever had come had either stayed or left by another route. Ethan's mind worked through possibilities. The warriors had already been here once. Could be they'd returned to see if he'd run. Or maybe the settlers the leader had spoken of had found him first. Either way, there was no safety in guessing wrong. He stepped back inside, pulled his few belongings close, and started banking the fire low to cut the smoke. The shadows lengthened on the cave walls, flickering with each shift of the coals. Night settled over the pass in a slow, suffocating crawl. The silence outside was absolute. Too absolute. A man who'd spent enough nights in the wilderness could tell when the woods were holding their breath. It meant there was something moving that didn't belong, something that made every bird, every squirrel, every living thing go still. Lying in his bedroll, Ethan kept one hand on his knife and the other on the carved stone, its edges pressing into his skin like a reminder. Somewhere past midnight, a sound reached him. Faint, but clear enough to cut through the stillness. A branch snapping under weight. Then another. The steps were slow, deliberate, not the hurried movement of someone lost in the dark. Whoever it was knew exactly where they were going. Ethan eased to the cave entrance and peered through a narrow gap in the rocks. At first there was nothing, just blackness between the pines. Then a figure resolved. A lone rider, his horse picking its way carefully over the snow-covered rocks. The man wore no war paint, no military coat, just a heavy hide jacket and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He stopped 20 yards from the cave, sat still for a moment, and then slowly turned his head toward Ethan's hiding spot. The firelight didn't reach that far, but Ethan felt the weight of the man's eyes all the same. They stayed that way for what felt like minutes, neither moving, the cold gnawing at Ethan's exposed fingers. Then the rider touched his heels to the horse's flanks and melted back into the trees without a word. Ethan stayed crouched long after he was gone, straining for any sign of pursuit. There was none. Only the mark on the spruce, the churned snow, and the knowledge that more than one kind of shadow was moving through these mountains tonight. When dawn came, thin and colorless, Ethan didn't feel any safer. He had the sense that the game was tightening, lines being drawn in the snow, sides chosen without his consent. And as he boiled the morning's water over the small fire, he kept glancing at the carved stone. Whatever it meant, it had already reached men on horseback, and it had led them straight to him. The morning sky over the pass was a hard, metallic gray, the kind that meant snow before sundown. Ethan stepped outside, boots crunching over crusted drifts, scanning the slope for movement. For a moment, all was still. No tracks, no sign of the lone rider from the night before. But the hairs on his arms lifted under the coat. He knew better than to trust the quiet. In these mountains, silence was often the loudest warning. He was halfway to checking his nearest snare when it happened. The faintest thud in the snow, followed by another, then another. Not the erratic pattern of an animal. This was rhythm, heavy and measured, multiplied many times over. Ethan froze. The sound was coming from above, along the ridgeline. He turned slowly, eyes sweeping the jagged horizon, and saw them. At first, they were only shapes, dark against the snow, too still to be mistaken for deer. Then the shapes resolved into riders, cresting the ridge one by one, their horses sending up little bursts of white dust with each step. The line kept growing, more and more figures appearing until they stretched across the slope like the teeth of a saw. 30 men, maybe more, each armed, each watching him. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He'd been in tight spots before, but nothing like this. This wasn't a chance encounter. This was a deliberate arrival, a display of force. The war party descended in perfect order, hooves muffled by the snow, until they fanned out in a wide arc before his shelter. The formation was no accident. It left him with nowhere to run. At the center rode the leader he'd met before, tall, broad-shouldered, his thick braids swaying against his back. He dismounted with a slow, deliberate motion and began walking toward Ethan. Behind him, the warriors sat their horses like statues, the steam of their breath curling upward into the cold air. No one spoke. No one moved except the leader. When he stopped a few feet away, Ethan could see details he hadn't noticed the first time. The faint scars along the man's cheekbone, the way his eyes missed nothing. "You stayed," the leader said, his voice low but carrying. "Good. That means you are ready to answer." Ethan swallowed hard. Answer for what? The leader's gaze flicked to the pocket where the carved stone rested. For what my uncle gave you, and for what it means. Before Ethan could speak, a signal passed through the warriors, not with words, but with subtle shifts in posture, the kind soldiers use when they've trained together for years. In the space of a heartbeat, the formation tightened, closing the arc until Ethan felt the press of 30 pairs of eyes on him. It was not threatening in the loud, reckless way of frontier gangs. This was controlled, calculated, a reminder that he was alive only because they allowed it. The leader gestured toward the cave. "We talk inside." Ethan hesitated. Letting them into his shelter felt like handing over the last thing that was his. but refusing might be the same as drawing a blade. He stepped aside, and the leader ducked into the cave, the carved stone's weight in Ethan's pocket feeling heavier than ever. 2 more warriors followed, their eyes scanning every inch of the space. Inside, the firelight flickered over the leader's face. "The men who hurt my uncle are close," he said. "They know this pass. They will come here, and soon. When they do, they will bring soldiers behind them. You are in the path now, whether you wish it or not." Ethan sat on his haunches, staring into the flames. "And if I don't want to be part of it?" The leader's reply was almost a whisper. "Then you should have left the old man in the snow." Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the faint creak of saddle leather and the occasional snort of a restless horse. Inside, the air felt heavier than the mountain itself. Ethan looked from the leader to the 2 silent warriors by the entrance. "So," he said finally, "what happens if I stay?" The leader leaned forward, his shadow stretching across the cave wall. "If you stay, you stand with us, and when the time comes, you fight."
The leader's words hung in the cave like smoke, heavy and hard to breathe. Ethan met his eyes, searching for some hint of bluff, but there was none. This was a man who had lived through winters that killed softer men, a man who did not waste words. "Your uncle," Ethan said slowly. "He's not just any elder, is he?" The leader's gaze held steady for a long moment before he spoke. "My uncle is Matawakasa, chief of our people. He has led us through 30 winters, kept us fed when the rivers froze and the herds vanished. The men who hurt him did not do so by chance. They came for him." The words were spoken with a quiet certainty that carried more weight than any shout. Ethan felt the realization settle in his gut. The old man he'd carried across the pass wasn't just important to these warriors. He was the spine of their whole tribe. The leader crouched beside the fire, his eyes fixed on the flames. They shot him when he would not give them what they wanted: land, trails, our ground. His mouth tightened. They thought the pass would finish what their bullets could not. Ethan thought of the old man's weight on his shoulders, the slow, rasping breath, the way his hand had gripped Ethan's coat even in half-consciousness. He hadn't been running blindly. He'd been racing a clock measured in heartbeats. One of the warriors by the entrance spoke in their language, and the leader's expression darkened. "Our scouts saw their camp. The men who hurt him are 2 valleys east. They travel with others, killers who will not leave this mountain without blood on their hands." Ethan rubbed a hand over his jaw. "And you think they'll come through here?" The leader nodded once. "They will follow the old trail. It leads straight to this cave. And when they do, soldiers will follow their bodies." Ethan understood the trap instantly. Settlers dead in tribal territory was a story the army would never forgive. It didn't matter who fired first. "So you're here to... what? Cut them off before they get here?" The leader's eyes flicked toward the entrance, where snow swirled in the wind. "We are here to end them before their lies end us." The carved stone felt heavier in Ethan's pocket, as though it had been waiting for this moment. He pulled it out and set it on the ground between them. "He gave me this before he walked into the trees." "Why?" For the first time, the leader's expression softened, just slightly. "That stone is a mark of protection. It says you acted with honor toward our chief. It means no hand of my people will be raised against you. But it also means you carry his debt. And the one who carries such a mark does not turn away when the debt is called." Ethan stared at the markings, the way the firelight caught their curves and lines. He had no tribe, no family, no stake in this fight. And yet somehow he was already tied to it. "If I walk away now," he asked, "what happens?" The leader didn't look away. "You will be watched. You will be safe from us. But you will carry the weight of knowing you left men to fight alone for what is theirs." The wind outside shifted, bringing with it a faint, distant sound. the low, uneven thump of horses moving over snow. The leader's head turned slightly, eyes narrowing. He rose to his full height. "Decide soon, Ethan Cole. The mountain does not give men much time to choose." Ethan's hand closed over the stone. It was warm now, almost pulsing. He didn't know what choice he would make when the moment came. But he knew one thing for certain. The truth he'd learned tonight had burned away the last illusion that this was just another mountain storm. The wind outside was carrying more than snow. It was carrying war. The sound of distant hooves didn't fade with the wind. It grew sharper, more distinct, the rhythm of a small group moving fast. Ethan stepped to the mouth of the cave, eyes scanning the snow-swept slope. Far off, tiny figures cut across the white, heading toward the timberline 2 valleys over. The leader joined him, his expression unreadable. "Scouts," he said. "They have eyes on the killers." The cold air bit at Ethan's cheeks, but the leader's words bit harder. "How close?" Ethan asked. The leader's gaze followed the tracks. "Closer than I expected. They've been hunting through the night. Their horses are tired, but so are ours. The difference is, we know where they are going." He pointed to a shadowed ridge in the distance. "The old trail runs there. It will bring them here whether they know it or not." Ethan glanced down at the snow underfoot. The morning light revealed more than it had the night before. Faint but fresh imprints near the cave, leading into the trees. These weren't from the warriors. The spacing was wrong, too narrow. "Someone's been here already," he said quietly. The leader followed his eyes, then nodded. "Yes, and they were watching you." The certainty in his voice made Ethan's stomach twist. The warriors moved quickly once the decision was made. 2 scouts disappeared into the timber without a sound. Another rider left the arc and headed downslope to shadow the killer's trail. Ethan stayed near the cave, watching as the leader conferred with a man who carried a long rifle wrapped in hide. The conversation was short, sharp, the kind of talk men have when every second matters. Not long after, one of the scouts returned, his breath fogging in the cold. He spoke rapidly in their language, his eyes darting toward Ethan more than once. The leader listened, then turned. "They are 3 miles away, moving slow, blood in their tracks." Ethan frowned. "Blood?" The leader nodded. "One of their men is hurt, badly. They leave a red trail in the snow, easy to follow." Ethan pictured it. Dark splashes against the white, a living wound dragging itself toward shelter. "That means they're desperate," he said, "and desperate men are dangerous." The leader gave a grim half-smile. "Yes, that is why we find them first." He looked at Ethan, measuring him again. "You can come, or you can wait here and see who reaches you first." The thought of sitting in the cave, listening for the approach of either side, made Ethan's skin crawl. "I'll come," he said. The leader didn't nod in approval, didn't thank him. He simply turned and gave orders. Within minutes, the war party was moving, fanning out in a loose arc to avoid leaving an obvious trail. Ethan kept close to the leader, the carved stone in his pocket bouncing with each step. The snow grew deeper as they climbed toward the ridge, forcing them to slow. The blood trail became more obvious now, splashed across drifts and smeared where a body had stumbled or been dragged. Ethan knelt once, pressing his fingers into the edge of one stain. Still tacky. "They passed here less than an hour ago," he said. The leader gave him a sharp look, then continued forward without comment. By midday, the trees thinned, opening to a small saddle between peaks. The wind cut through with a hollow roar, carrying scents of wood smoke and horse sweat. The leader raised a hand, and the warriors froze. Below, just visible through the pines, a thin column of smoke curled into the gray sky. The killer's camp. The leader leaned close, his voice barely above the wind. "They think they are safe. They are wrong. Ethan stared down at the smoke, the blood trail leading straight to it, and felt the weight of what was about to happen. This wasn't just a hunt. This was the narrowing of all choices, the point where blood in the snow would decide who walked away from these mountains alive. From the ridge, Ethan could see them clearly now. 3 men around a low fire, their movements slow and uneven. One sat with his back to a log, clutching his side. Another paced the edge of camp, a rifle slung carelessly in his hands. The third knelt by the fire, turning strips of meat on a blackened pan. The air carried the scent of it even from here. It mixed with the sharper tang of wood smoke and something fouler, the metallic bite of blood. The leader crouched beside Ethan, pointing toward the injured man. "That one is their weak link, but the others, they will not go down easy." His tone wasn't boast or warning. It was simple fact. The warriors around them were spread across the slope, hidden among snow-laden pines. No one moved without the leader's signal. Every breath, every sound seemed to hang in the cold air. Ethan's eyes kept going to the meat cooking over the fire. It was too red, too fresh for something taken from the hunt. "That's not deer," he said quietly. The leader gave a slow nod. "Stolen from a ranch they burned yesterday. Men like this do not hunt for what they can take by force." His jaw tightened. "And when they take, they kill." The truth of it sat heavy between them. Ethan knew what the next step would be. The warriors would strike, fast and hard, before the killers could react. But the leader didn't move. Instead, he turned to Ethan, eyes sharp. "You carried my uncle through the snow when others would have left him. You hold the stone. That makes you part of this now. But you must choose it. Not because we force you. Because you know it is right." The words caught Ethan off guard. He'd been expecting orders, not a choice. His mind flicked through every possibility. If he fought with them, there was no going back. The killer's blood on his hands would tie him to this tribe forever. If he walked away, he'd carry the stone still, but it would feel like a hollow thing, stripped of its meaning. Below, one of the killers stood and stretched, scanning the tree line. He didn't see anything. None of them did. But Ethan noticed the way his hand lingered near the rifle's grip. They weren't as relaxed as they seemed. Men on the run never were. He realized that whatever decision he made, it had to be now. The leader spoke again, quieter this time. "You have no people, no home. The mountain takes everything from a man who walks it alone. But stand with us today, and you will have brothers who would give their lives for you." His voice was calm, but it carried an edge, not persuasion, but truth laid bare. Ethan's fingers closed around the carved stone in his pocket. It felt warmer than it should have, almost alive. His mind flashed back to the old man's face in the snow, the weight of his body over the pass, the way his hand had pressed the stone into Ethan's palm. A gift, yes, but also a burden. He looked back at the campfire below and knew that leaving wasn't truly an option. He met the leader's gaze and gave a single, deliberate nod. The leader's eyes held his for a moment longer. Then he rose, raising one hand in a silent signal. Across the slope, shadows shifted, boughs were drawn, and the cold air seemed to tighten around them. Ethan had made his choice, and whatever happened next, there was no turning back. The leader's raised hand froze the world in place. Even the wind seemed to pause. Ethan crouched low behind a snow-crusted boulder, his breath pluming in the cold, eyes locked on the killer's camp below. The injured man leaned against a log, head sagging forward, while the other two shifted restlessly, glancing toward the tree line as if sensing movement they couldn't quite place. A soft whistle cut through the stillness. The signal. Arrows hissed from the shadows, striking the snow in precise warning shots just inches from the killer's boots. The pacing man spun, rifle snapping to his shoulder. "Show yourselves!" he shouted, his voice ragged with fear and defiance. No one answered. The only reply was the faint creak of boughs being drawn again. The injured man swore under his breath, clutching his side. "We gotta move!" he barked to the others. The leader of the killers, a gaunt figure with a long, unshaven face, stepped forward instead, scanning the tree line. His eyes locked briefly on Ethan's position, and in that moment, Ethan knew the man had guessed he wasn't one of the warriors. "Boy!" the killer called, voice carrying across the snow. "You there! You're not with them, are you? You don't have to die for their fight. Let us pass, and we'll walk away." Ethan stayed low, every muscle tight. The leader beside him didn't move, didn't speak, but Ethan felt the unspoken weight of the moment. This was his to answer. He rose just enough for his voice to carry. "This is their land. You brought your fight here. You leave now, or you face them." The killer laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You think they'll spare you when this is over? You're just another mouth to feed?" Ethan didn't flinch. "Maybe. But I'd rather die beside men who stand for something than run with men who kill for nothing." The laughter stopped. The killer's face hardened, and his rifle came up fast. Ethan didn't think. He dropped to the snow as the crack of the shot shattered the silence. Splinters burst from the boulder behind him. Before the sound had even faded, the leader's hand came down in a sharp gesture, and the warriors moved. They hit the camp like a winter storm, sudden, overwhelming, unstoppable. Arrows thudded into the logs, forcing the killers down. Two warriors swept in from the flanks, knocking rifles aside with tomahawks and spears. Ethan scrambled forward, closing the gap to keep the killers from retreating toward the ridge. The injured man went down first, tackled and disarmed before he could limp 2 steps. The pacing one swung his rifle like a club, but a warrior caught the blow on his forearm and drove him into the snow. The leader of the killers fought harder, dodging an arrow and firing twice into the trees, but the shots went wide. Ethan stepped into his path, knife drawn, forcing him back toward the fire. "You're finished," Ethan said, breath clouding between them. The killer's eyes flicked toward the ridge, calculating an escape. Before he could move, a warrior's tomahawk slammed into the snow at his feet, close enough to jolt him still. Hands grabbed his arms, forcing the rifle from his grip. The fight was over in less than a minute. The leader of the warriors stood in the center of the camp, his breath steady, his voice calm as he gave the order to bind the prisoners. Ethan stood just outside the ring of warriors, heart pounding, knowing that what had just happened wasn't victory. It was only the beginning. The gunfire would carry far in the cold mountain air, and someone would be coming to see who had lived and who had died. The gunshots still echoed faintly through the ridges when the last of the killer's weapons was stripped away. Their leader knelt in the snow, wrists bound with rawhide, his eyes darting from the warriors to Ethan like a trapped animal searching for a weak point. The 2 others huddled near the fire, one groaning from his side wound, the other shivering despite his coat. No one spoke. The mountain seemed to listen. The leader of the warriors stepped forward, his voice carrying in the still air. "These men will answer for what they've done. To our chief, to our people, to the settlers they murdered." His gaze shifted to Ethan. "You stood with us. That will not be forgotten." Ethan gave a small nod, unsure how to answer, the carved stone heavy in his pocket. He'd fought beside them, but part of him still felt like an outsider, standing on the edge of something much larger than himself. 2 scouts moved quickly, erasing tracks, scattering snow to blur the signs of the fight. Ethan realized the reason. The gunfire would bring soldiers. If they arrived to find dead settlers in tribal territory, no explanation would stop the retaliation. The warriors weren't just covering their trail, they were buying time for their people. The leader crouched beside the bound killers, speaking low in their own language. One of them flinched. The other spat in the snow. Without looking up, the leader said, "They will live, for now. They will tell the truth when the soldiers come, or the snow will take them before spring." His tone made it clear this was not a threat, but a certainty. Ethan helped drag the injured man to his feet, feeling the weight of the moment. He'd never thought of himself as part of any side, any cause. But as he looked at the faces of the warriors, men who had trusted him to stand in their circle, Something shifted inside. He was no longer just surviving these mountains. He was tied to them. By the time they returned to the pass, snow had begun to fall again, soft and steady, covering the churned ground in a clean white sheet. The prisoners were placed in the shelter of a rock wall, guarded by 2 warriors. The leader joined Ethan by the cave entrance. "When the soldiers come, you will speak for what happened. They will believe you sooner than they believe us." Ethan frowned. "And if they don't?" The leader's eyes stayed on the snow. "Then you will still have spoken the truth." The sound of distant hoofbeats reached them before long. Not the scattered rhythm of a hunting party, but the steady, disciplined cadence of cavalry. The warriors melted into the rocks and trees, leaving Ethan standing alone outside the cave. Moments later, the soldiers appeared over the ridge, blue coats stark against the white. At their head rode a captain with a hard-set face and eyes that missed nothing. Ethan told the story as agreed. Strangers arriving in the storm, demanding shelter, firing warning shots when refused. The killer's stolen rifles and blood-stained coats did the rest of the talking. The captain listened, studied the scene, then ordered the prisoners taken away for trial. No questions about the warriors hiding just beyond sight. No mention of the chief who had nearly died in the snow. When the soldiers were gone, the warriors emerged again, silent as the falling flakes. The leader stepped forward, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Today, you were not alone. Today, you were one of us." Ethan drew out the carved stone, turning it once in his palm before closing his fingers around it. "Then I'll keep this," he said. "If it means what you say it means." That night, Ethan sat beside a fire in the warriors' winter camp, the snow falling thick around the lodges. The air was warm with wood smoke and the low murmur of men's voices. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the weight of being rootless. The mountains were still dangerous, the world still hard, but here in the circle of firelight, he belonged.